Hi, I'm Kelly Schiffman. I'm a PhD student at Yale University, and today I want to talk about necessary and sufficient conditions. We hear the words necessary and sufficient all the time. Merely taking the test isn't sufficient for passing it. The lawyer convinced the jury that there is sufficient evidence to convict the accused. Pain is a necessary part of every human life. Practice is really necessary for success. But what exactly do these words mean? If P is necessary for Q, then Q cannot be true unless P is true. Philosophers sometimes put this by saying that Q is true only if P is true. Let's consider a case to help us get clear on this. What's necessary for getting accepted to a university? Well, you might think that one necessary condition is being human. You can only be accepted to a university if you're human. Another necessary condition is submitting an application. You can't get accepted to a university unless you apply there. Another necessary condition is perhaps having decent grades. Okay, so now what about sufficient conditions? If P is sufficient for Q, then P's being true is enough to make Q true. Philosophers often put this by saying that if P is true, then Q is true. Now it's a little harder to think of a sufficient condition for getting accepted to the university. But consider some 17-year-old who just won the Nobel Prize in chemistry. Seems like that's pretty sufficient for getting accepted to the university. Now necessary and sufficient conditions come in all combinations. Here's an example of a necessary but not sufficient condition. Steering well is a necessary condition for driving well. You can't drive well unless you steer your car well. However, steering well is not sufficient for driving well, since steering well is not enough to make it true that you are driving well. You can steer well, but still drive badly for other reasons. Here's an example of a sufficient but not necessary condition. Boiling potatoes in water is a sufficient condition for cooking them, since it's true that boiling potatoes is enough to cook them. However, boiling potatoes in water is not a necessary condition for cooking them, since you can cook them in many other ways. Frying them, grilling them, baking them, roasting them. And finally, here's an example of a necessary and sufficient condition. Getting all of the answers correct on a test is necessary for getting a perfect score on the test, because you will not get a perfect score on the test unless you get all the answers correct. Getting all of the answers correct is also a sufficient condition for getting a perfect score, because getting all the answers correct is enough to get a perfect score. There's nothing else you must do in order to get a perfect score.